What is the price of a single human life? For Commander Nikola Petrović, the answer was 67 souls. He made a deal to save his wife. The payment was tendered in the lives of his brothers and sisters in arms. The file is cold to the touch. It speaks of a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary, a hidden partisan camp deep in the forests of Bosnia, August 1943. The German report calls it a successful anti-partisan operation. But the photographs tell a different story. This was not a battle. It was a methodical slaughter. We see sleeping bags riddled with machine gun fire, a pot of coffee spilled over a long dead fire. There are no signs of a prolonged fight. There are only the bodies of the ambushed frozen in the last, desperate moments of their lives. 67 of them. Men and women who trusted their commander with their lives. How does it come to this? How does a decorated hero, a man known for his courage and tactical skill, orchestrate the annihilation of his own unit? How does a husband's love become a traitor's weapon? To understand this, we need to go back 8 days, to a time when Nikola Petrović was still a commander, a husband, and a hero. In the summer of 1943, the Yugoslav partisans were a ghost army. They haunted the mountains and the forests, a constant bleeding wound in the side of the German occupation. Nikola Petrović was one of their most effective commanders. Survivor testimonies describe him as a brilliant strategist, a man who could read the terrain like a map and anticipate the enemy's moves. He was respected, he was trusted, but he was not alone. His greatest asset was also his greatest vulnerability. Her name was Elena. Elena Petrović was not just the commander's wife. She was a vital part of the unit. The official records list her as a courier and intelligence operative. She was the nerve endings of their small army, the link to other partisan groups and to the network of informants in the villages below. She was brave, resourceful, and she knew the mountain paths better than anyone. Theirs was a partnership forged in fire. They shared the same risks, the same dream of a free Yugoslavia. Their love was the quiet center of their brutal world. On August 15th, Elena embarked on what was supposed to be a routine mission, a simple information exchange with an informant in a village 20 kilometers away. A journey she had made a dozen times before. She was expected back before nightfall, but she never arrived. German operational logs from that day are chillingly mundane. They record the activities of a motorized patrol from the 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division, the infamous Prince Eugen. Their orders were to conduct a routine sweep of the area. They were not looking for anyone in particular. It was a matter of pure, terrible chance. A farmer, sympathetic to their cause but terrified of the consequences, saw it all. Elena was walking along a forest track when the German patrol appeared. There was no escape. She was captured without a single shot being fired. For the Gestapo in the nearby town, the capture of a female partisan was routine. They expected to get some low-level information and then execute her. But during the initial interrogation, Elena's identity was revealed. She was not just a courier. She was the wife of Commander Nikola Petrović. Suddenly, the prisoner in their hands was no longer a simple partisan. She was leverage. She was the perfect psychological weapon, a key designed to fit the one lock that could break a man like Nikola. A plan was immediately set in motion, not to learn what Elena knew, but to see what her husband was willing to do to keep her alive. For 5 days, the camp existed in a state of quiet dread. Nikola told his men that Elena was missing, presumed captured or killed on her mission. He projected the image of a grieving commander, channeling his energy into reinforcing their position. But the survivors' testimonies recorded years later all note a change in him. The sharp, decisive leader was gone. In his place was a haunted man, his eyes constantly scanning the forest, as if expecting an enemy he could not see. He was not waiting for the Germans. He was waiting for a message. It came on the evening of August 20th. The messenger was not a soldier. He was a local farmer, a man who had supplied them with food, his face a mask of pure terror. He had been intercepted by a German patrol. They did not harm him. They gave him a task. He was to deliver a package and a verbal ultimatum to Commander Petrović. The package contained a small silver locket. Nikola did not need to open it. He knew the photograph of his mother that was inside. It was the one he had given Elena before she left. This was the proof of life. The verbal message, as recorded in the farmer's later deposition to Tito's security forces, was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It was simple, brutal, and left no room for negotiation. "Tell the commander we have his wife," the German officer had said. "She is unharmed for now. Tell him he knows the location of the old hunter's cabin on the North Ridge. He is to go there alone before the dawn of the 23rd. He will leave a sign, the location of his camp. If the sign is there, his wife will be released within a week. If it is not, he will receive her head in a box." 48 hours. The demand was not for surrender. It was not for information on other partisan groups. It was for something much more intimate, much more monstrous. They wanted him to personally sign the death warrant of every man and woman under his command. They were not just trying to win a battle. They were conducting a psychological vivisection, eager to see if a man's love for one person could outweigh his duty to many. When the farmer left, Nikola retreated into a silence that was more terrifying than any rage. He sealed himself inside his small tent. The commander, the man his soldiers looked to for answers, had vanished. He was now just a husband trapped in an impossible moral calculus. What does a man do in that abyss of choice? The files can only speculate. He had two sacred oaths, one sworn to his country and his comrades, a public vow to fight and die for their liberation. The other sworn to his wife, a private vow to love and protect her. The war had now placed these two sacred duties in direct mortal opposition. To honor one was to utterly betray the other. He could tell his men they were loyal, they would have understood, some would have even volunteered for a suicidal rescue mission. But he knew it was a fantasy. An attack on the Gestapo headquarters would be a massacre. And what if he told them, and they chose the path of the soldier? What if they told him that one life, even Elena's, was not worth 67? Could he live with their cold, correct logic? Could he watch them prepare for battle knowing he had condemned his own wife to a gruesome execution? No, he had to carry this alone. The post-war OSNA report on his case describes his actions as the complete privatization of a military command decision. He ceased to be an officer of the partisan army. He became a singular entity, his only objective the preservation of his wife. The 67 people sleeping just meters away from him were no longer his responsibility. They had become the price for the next day and a half. He was a ghost. He did not eat. He did not speak. He just paced the perimeter of the camp, a caged animal wrestling with a demon only he could see. He looked at the faces of his soldiers, the young boy, barely 17, cleaning his rifle. The two sisters who had joined after the Germans had executed their parents. His second in command, a man who had fought beside him for 2 years. Each one was a nail in the coffin of his conscience. But then he would close his eyes and he would see Elena's face. The choice was not between love and duty. It was between two different kinds of hell. He had to decide which one he could live in. On the night of August 22nd, with the German deadline just hours away, he emerged from his tent. The agony was gone from his face. It had been replaced by a terrifying, hollow calm. The decision had been made. The forest at night is a neutral space. It does not judge, it simply watches. On the night of August 22nd, it watched as Commander Nikola Petrović walked away from his sleeping camp. He moved like a ghost through the trees, his steps silent. Every soldier in that camp trusted him completely. They were his family, bound by shared blood and shared belief. He was their shield, and he was walking to deliver them, bound and helpless, to the executioner. His journey to the hunter's cabin on the North Ridge was a pilgrimage of the damned. The path was familiar, yet every rock and tree seemed alien, accusatory. The German after-action report notes that the signal was to be simple and deniable. There would be no written note, no map. The intelligence had to be delivered in a way that left no physical trace. He reached the dilapidated cabin just after midnight. This was the spot. The air was cold, but the chill inside him was a thing of ice, a coldness that had extinguished his soul. He did not hesitate. The OSNA file speculates that any hesitation at this point would have shattered his resolve. The act itself had to be mechanical. He took out his knife. On the ancient oak tree designated by the Germans, he carved a single vertical line. Then 10 centimeters to the right, he carved a shorter horizontal line. It was a symbol with no inherent meaning. But to the German mountain troops who would find it, it was a map, a pointer. It meant, from this spot, travel 2 kilometers due south. You will find them there. He was done in less than a minute. The betrayal was complete. 67 lives traded for a scratch on a tree. He returned to the camp before dawn. He did not sleep. He took up a watch position on the western perimeter, slightly away from the main concentration of his troops. It was a plausible action for a worried commander. It was also the calculated move of a traitor ensuring his own survival. He was positioning himself to be a witness, not a victim. Dawn on August 23rd broke with a deceptive beauty. A thin mist clung to the forest floor. The camp was just beginning to stir. The smell of a nascent cook fire hung in the air. This is the moment that one of the few survivors, a woman named Elena, later described in her testimony. "There was a bird singing," she said. "I remember that. I was thinking it was a beautiful morning. Then the world ended." The attack did not begin with a warning. It began with a sound. The ripping, deafening roar of a dozen MG-42s opening fire simultaneously from the high ground on 3 sides. The Germans had used his signal. They had surrounded the camp in the dark with surgical precision. It was a perfect kill zone, a trap from which there was no escape. The first volley tore through the canvas tents, annihilating the partisans as they slept. Those who managed to scramble out were cut down in seconds. It was not a battle. It was a methodical eradication. Mortar rounds walked across the small clearing, turning the camp into a charnel house. From his position, Nikola fired his rifle into the trees. He yelled commands that no one could hear over the din. He was playing his part. The German report mentions light resistance from an outlying sentry post, which was quickly suppressed. A single bullet grazed his arm, a wound that was either a lucky chance for his story or a deliberate self-inflicted detail to sell his lie. The firing lasted for 11 minutes, then silence. A silence more profound and terrible than the noise that came before it. Nikola waited. He saw the German troops move through the camp, a single shot fired now and then to finish off the wounded. Then, as planned, they melted back into the forest. They were not there to hold ground, they were there to kill. He emerged from his cover, his arm bleeding, his face a mask of manufactured shock and grief. The camp was gone. It was a ruin of blood and torn fabric. He found 4 other survivors, 4 people who had been by sheer luck on the very edges of the camp and had managed to crawl away in the initial chaos. They looked at their commander, this tragic figure bleeding and broken, and they saw a hero who had been impossibly unlucky. They saw a man who had lost everything. They did not see the architect of their destruction. The performance of his life had just begun. He had upheld his vow to his wife, and now he had to live with the cost, in the brutal meritocracy of partisan warfare. Survival itself was a form of honor. Nikola Petrović and the 4 other survivors were not seen as failures. They were tragic heroes. They were the sole remnants of a unit that had been wiped out by the German war machine. When they finally staggered into the territory of a larger partisan brigade weeks later, they were welcomed as brothers who had passed through fire. Nikola's story was flawless. He told of a surprise German attack of overwhelming force. He spoke of fighting until the last moment, of seeing his comrades fall. His own superficial wound was proof of his presence in the battle. The other 4 survivors who had been on the periphery of the ambush could only confirm the suddenness and brutality of the assault. They had no reason to doubt their commander's version of events. In their eyes, he was as much a victim as they were. He leaned into the role of the tragic commander. The OSNA psychological profile, written years later, calls it a classic case of transference and projection. He publicly mourned the men and women he had secretly condemned. He spoke of them by name, recounting their courage. This performance was not just for others, it was for himself. It was a desperate attempt to build a new reality over the gaping pit of his treason. The memory of his wife became his shield and his public identity. Everyone knew Elena had been captured. Everyone now assumed she had been executed, her death a catalyst for the Germans discovering the camp. It made a grim, logical sense. Nikola was now the man who had lost everything, his unit and his wife, to the cause. This narrative elevated him. He was no longer just a commander. He was a martyr, a living symbol of the partisans' immense sacrifice. He was given a staff position in the new brigade, a role that kept him away from frontline command, but allowed the partisans to utilize his strategic mind. He lived this lie for nearly 2 years, 2 years of looking his fellow partisans in the eye, 2 years of attending memorials for the fallen, knowing he was their executioner. The internal cost of this deception is impossible to document. There are no files that can record a soul's decay, but we know he began to drink heavily. He became withdrawn, prone to fits of dark melancholy. His comrades saw this as the understandable grief of a broken man. They did not see the corrosive guilt of a traitor. Then in May of 1945, the war in Europe ended. The German Reich collapsed. The concentration camps were liberated. And from the gates of hell, the ghosts began to return. Elena Petrović was one of them. She had survived. After Nikola had given the signal, the Germans had honored their side of the bargain, in a manner of speaking. They did not execute her. They transferred her to a concentration camp in Austria. It was a death sentence, just a slower one. But she had endured. The news of her survival reached Nikola in June. To his comrades, it was a miracle, a ray of impossible light after years of darkness. The tragic hero would finally have his reward, a reunion with the wife for whom he had suffered so much. He found her in a crowded refugee processing center in Belgrade. The place was a chaotic swirl of lost souls trying to find their way back to a world that no longer existed. He saw her across the room. She was gaunt, her eyes hollowed out by what she had seen, but it was her. He called her name. She turned. Their eyes met. And in that single silent moment, Nikola Petrović's 2-year performance came to a catastrophic end. He had expected tears. He had expected an embrace. He had expected the reunion that would finally, somehow justify the horror of his choice. He received none of it. Elena looked at him, and her expression was not one of love, or relief, or even hatred. It was one of cold, absolute clarity. She had had 2 years to think, 2 years to piece together fragments of information from other prisoners. She knew the date of her transfer from the Gestapo prison. She knew it was just days after the German soldiers had been celebrating a major victory against a partisan unit in her sector. She knew her husband was the only one who knew the camp's location. She had lived with this terrible equation in the darkness of the barracks, and she had already solved it. She did not say a word. She did not have to. Her silence was a verdict, She simply held his gaze for a moment, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. She had survived their shared war, but she would not survive it with him. He had saved her life, but he had lost her completely. Now, truly, he had nothing. He was just a traitor standing alone in the ruins of his own making. The end of a war is not an end to killing. It is merely a change in administration. As Josip Broz Tito consolidated his power in the newly formed socialist Yugoslavia, a new secret war began. It was a war against the past. Tito's security service, the formidable OZNA, was tasked with a singular, ruthless mission: to hunt down and eliminate every collaborator, war criminal, and traitor who had operated during the occupation. It was a time of quiet, methodical vengeance. In the autumn of 1945, an investigator from the OZNA's Department of Internal Affairs was assigned a cold case. The file concerned the complete annihilation of a partisan unit in Bosnia in August 1943. On the surface, it was just one of hundreds of such tragedies, but a few details didn't add up. The German attack was too perfect. The unit's location was supposed to have been known only to its commander and his courier, his wife, and the commander, Nikola Petrović, had survived. The investigator was a patient man. He began by re-interviewing the 4 other survivors. Their stories were consistent with Nikola's, but when pressed on the precise details of the camp's layout and their positions, tiny inconsistencies emerged. More importantly, none of them could recall a single German casualty. It was a massacre, not a battle. This fact, more than any other, smelled of a setup. The crucial piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Elena Petrović. She had not formally accused her husband. She had simply attempted to disappear, to start a new life. But the OZNA was thorough. They found her working in a hospital in Sarajevo. Her testimony was not emotional. It was a cold recitation of facts: the date of her capture, the date of her transfer, and her chilling certainty that her survival was directly linked to the destruction of the camp. She did not need to guess what had happened. She knew. For the OZNA, this was the confirmation they needed. Nikola Petrović was no longer a tragic hero. He was the prime suspect in a mass murder investigation. They found him in the city of Mostar. He was not living the life of a respected veteran. He was a ghost, living in a single squalid room, working as a manual laborer. The OZNA file describes him as a broken man, consumed by alcoholism and an unspoken guilt. The man who had sacrificed his honor for his wife and been rejected by her had nothing left. The arrest was quiet, conducted at night. There was no public trial. Cases of partisan treason were considered a deep internal shame, to be dealt with far from the public eye. He was taken to a secure location for interrogation. The transcript of his confession has never been declassified. But we know he admitted everything. He told them about the German ultimatum, the signal on the tree, the choice he made. He recounted the entire sordid affair in a flat, dead voice. He was not asking for mercy. He was a man who had been waiting for the executioner for 3 years. In March of 1946, the sentence was carried out. They took him from his cell and drove him deep into a forest, a place not unlike the one where he had betrayed his comrades. There was no firing squad, no ceremony. A single OZNA officer carried out the execution with 1 shot to the back of the head. It was not an act of law. It was an act of sanitation, an erasure. The evidence is fragmented. Some details remain disputed, but the core facts are documented in military archives, witness testimonies, and declassified files. He was a commander who faced an impossible choice. He chose love over duty. He saved the life of his wife, and in doing so became the murderer of his friends. He survived the war, but he could not survive the peace. In the end, The only thing his terrible sacrifice bought him was a 3-year reprieve from a death he had already earned.